Our next speaker is Benjamin Torbert from Duke in NC State, who will be talking to us about the salience measurements of southern vowels.
Not many studies have attempted to empirically measure the salience of specific linguistic variables. The sociolinguist can often intuit what features tip listeners off about the region or ethnicity of a given speaker. There's not a great deal of quantitative support in the literature for judging which features are considered salient by the common listener. To attempt to measure the salience of individual vowels with respect to region and ethnicity, I've conducted several perception experiments using the speech of speakers from various parts of the eastern U.S. With different productions of what we generally regard as fairly salient vowels. Findings from 3 of the perception tests are presented here. In the first test, 14 speakers, some who back the O nucleus and some who front the O nucleus, were played for a group of undergraduates in North Carolina State. The frames were very short so as to isolate the variable as much as possible while still preserving recognizable speech. The participants were asked to rate the speakers on a scale of 1 to 5, from most southern to least southern, most being 5, and to guess the ethnicity of the speakers. Combining methodologies of Graff, Labov, and Harris, 86, Goskins, 97, and Thomas and Reeser, 2002, and forthcoming, and I believe they're giving one of their talks here at LAVIS. I included unmodified, monotonized, and low-pass filter tokens to eliminate fundamental frequency variation and segmental information, respectively, in order to better isolate the variable in both pre-voiced and pre-voiceless environments. Among participants surveyed, fronted O was not salient for determining region, but was salient for determining ethnicity. I then repeated the experiment with I in pre-voiceless contexts. Unsurprisingly, glide-reduced I proved salient for determining southernness to the listeners, but was not salient for ethnicity. The third test dealt with fronted U nuclei, and to my surprise, fronted U's strongest correlation was not with perceived ethnicity, like O, but rather with a negative affinity for region. That is, U fronters were perceived by listeners as not being from the listener's region to a greater degree than were U backers. Some background on the vowels in question. All of you all probably know most of this, but just to go quickly. O variation is well established in the literature. The Linguistic Atlas projects identified 3 centers for O fronting, one around Philadelphia, one in a band stretching from the area surrounding Columbus, Ohio, across eastern Ohio and into western Pennsylvania and northern West Virginia, and one in eastern North Carolina. Thomas notes that, based on the apparent time construct, the linguistic atlases would indicate that O fronting was established in Pennsylvania and around Pamlico Sound as early as the Civil War. Delmarva and inland North Carolina followed suit in subsequent decades. Fagan attests O fronting in Alabama as well. The feature is now all over the United States, still centered in the east, but as far afield as California and Oregon. Jeff Kahn presented on O fronting in Oregon, and mostly restricted to white speech. New England, the northern Great Plains, and the inland upper north have mostly escaped O fronting thus far. Labov has treated the southern vowel shift, in which O fronting plays a part, in detail on a number of occasions. The southern shift ranges from Texas up through the Gulf states in the middle Atlantic, as well as southern England, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. In Labov's more recent magnum opus, 2001, which deals with social factors and change, he discusses O in particular in establishing his target principle, quote, "and changes that hold constant or increase the amount of phonetic substance. The phonemic target for succeeding generations is not the general mean, but is shifted by some undetermined amount towards the salient outliers in the direction of the change. This would explain how O fronting spread, and why the youngest speakers in the established O fronting centers often have the heaviest degree of fronting. Among white speakers, realizations of I vary across the South. Some varieties glide-reduce I in all contexts, while others maintain the quote-unquote I split, that is, ungliding only in pre-voiced environments, while gliding before voiceless sounds. Thomas cites the southern Appalachians, North Carolina coastal plain, and the Gulf coastal plain as unglided across all environments, or glide reduced, while the Gulf Piedmont and the South Carolina, Georgia low country to some degree maintain the split. The back-raised I we're familiar with in the Delmarva and the Tidewater, the Pamlico Sound area, and the coastal cities of Wilmington and Charleston is receding and more of an outlier. African Americans, unfortunately, long characterized phonologically by sociolinguists mostly by their non-participation in white sound changes, are far less likely to weak glide or unglide pre-voiceless I, as we see in Bernstein 93. Anderson and Milroy do find some pre-voiceless ungliding in Detroit AAE, which they attribute in part to proximity to white Appalachian transplants there. But in general, we can say that the I split is common in AAE. Oo-fronting is another matter entirely. Perhaps a better question than where does oo-fronting occur would be where doesn't oo-fronting occur. Though oo-fronting was considered mostly southern in the early days of the linguistic atlas, now it's all over the place. Thomas has found it in Ohio, LaBeouf in Philadelphia, Luthen, as well as the Eckertines in California, Ash in the Great Lakes area, various researchers in Australia. We could go on and on. Oo-fronting does tend to be less favored by African Americans, but this certainly isn't categorical. But how to measure the layperson's perception of these matters? Back in 1986, Graff, LaBeouf, and Harris focused on fronted O as an ethnic marker in Philadelphia. They note that although whites hone in on certain variable features of syntax, copula deletion, invariant B, etc., to identify African Americans in Philadelphia have vowels that more closely approximate American norms than do whites in that city. Besides the famous variation with A and a slew of pre-R mergers, many white Philadelphians shift O such that a mid-back nucleus fronts and loses some rounding. O is even encroaching on ow, although non-peripherality of O seems to keep the two distinct. Graff, LaBeouf, and Harris report on two speakers, one white and one African American, of approximately the same class and locale. The white female fronts O, and the various tokens are dispersed with a great range on F2, while the African American male has a tighter cluster of backed O nuclei. The researchers wanted to figure out if speakers in the community were aware of the distinction, and finding a woman renowned among her friends for being able to do impressions of white speech, they asked her and other African American speakers to imitate white speakers. Many speakers were of little help in this endeavor, but the skilled impressionist managed a 5-minute monologue in what she figured was a white Philadelphia speaking style. They noticed that she produced frequent stressed and fronted O's, to the extent that they believed she had seized upon a stereotype that African Americans recognized about white Philadelphians. She was not nearly as successful, however, at copying the white owl. This convinced the researchers that the perception test was in order.